Welcome to part one of our meeting at the crossroads of grief and trauma awareness training, a psychosocial spiritual approach for service providers in Mi'kma'ki. Welcome. So as I begin with a land acknowledgement, I want to invite everybody to please use the chat to introduce yourself and join with me in a land acknowledgement, acknowledging the specific land where you are located. If you do not know the Mi'kmaq name for where you are located, for example, if you're in Cape Breton, you would say Unama'ki. I invite you to take this moment to Google and learn the name of the land where you're located, and then join with me through the chat. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Mi'kma'ki, and indeed the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers is in Mi'kma'ki. This is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers joins our members and our communities in the necessary labor of reconciliation. We are grateful to live and work together as treaty people in Mi'kma'ki. Let us take this moment for gratitude for this beautiful land, for the amazingly wise and brave Mi'kmaq leaders and communities who have cared for this land and who continue to care for and advocate for it. Please think of the lands, territories, and Indigenous peoples who have lived and continue to live within these lands, and how each of us individually and collectively can hold ourselves accountable to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples here and across Turtle Island. We are all treaty peoples. Lalayu. Thank you all. And I want to invite us to take this moment to take a deep breath and pause in gratitude. As we take another deep breath, let us recenter ourselves away from the ways colonization fills our minds and bodies with harmful energy. Let us take this moment to affirm our commitment to join in the important work of decolonization, which has affected so many across the planet. Let us take this moment to reflect upon the need for healing. For colonization is at the root of so much racism, genocide, and injustice, here and across the planet. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share, by working for justice for all human beings as an expression of our gratitude, as well as an expression of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we all must begin to learn and honor. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and one another. With that, I'm going to stop share. For those of you who don't know me, I am Anne Staritsky, and I am the professional practice and advocacy consultant with the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. And I am very excited that I get to be your Zoom host today for this really, really important training. And I'm going to introduce you to a few other people. So right now I'm going to introduce you to Danielle. I'm going to say a few words of introduction.
Hi, everyone. I am really excited to be here today. This work is very near and dear to my heart for sure. I previously worked in mental health and addictions as a trauma therapist originally. And so for sure, grief and trauma are two pieces that we talk about and that we feel and experience, both as professionals and as individuals. I had the privilege of connecting with the SchoolsPlus as a program, and we saw a tremendous need for this work, for this education. In fact, our staff and our colleagues were asking for, how do we do this work? How do we be present in this work? And so my colleague, Tracy Shea, and I put together a grant proposal that was generously funded by the Mental Health Foundation. And we knew exactly who we wanted to partner with on this, and that would be Serena Lewis. And she and I met kind of at a crossroads as well, of a time where we were doing some work regarding grief in the time of COVID. And then, as we know, we had the mass casualty occur during that time as well. And so grief and trauma became maybe our introduction to each other. But we have become very close working colleagues and friends as well. So I'm very excited to introduce this work, and I'm going to pass maybe the baton to Jolene Camo, who is a colleague of ours in SchoolsPlus as well, just to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jolene Camo, and I work with SchoolsPlus, as Danielle mentioned. I am the coordinator for the SchoolsPlus program with the CSAP, the Acadian School Board, and I have been working alongside the regional coordinators of SchoolsPlus, Danielle, Tracy, and Kristen, for about a year now in different capacities, but I am taking no credit for this great work that they've done. They've put this all together themselves. They've seen a need and they've addressed it. And so I've been watching from the sidelines and will take zero credit for the awesome work that they've done for today. But I do love working with them. They are amazing people. So I'll pass it on to Kristen to introduce herself.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so grateful that there's 212 people who are logged on online to join us in this incredibly important conversation that impacts us all across the human service professions, community supports, and is intricately connected to our children and youth across this province. So I am Kristen Anderson. I'm the Regional Coordinator for SchoolsPlus for Western Zone. And I'm overjoyed to be partnering with the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. Thank you so much, and for all of your support on this incredibly important webinar series. In addition to that, I work with my colleagues in Danielle and Tracy Shea, who can't be with us today. I'm just going to see if Melody Skeet, who is our regional coordinator in Central, she's having some technology problems. It's technology is being very Monday to her. So I'll ask her maybe if she is able to pop in and say hello. I would love for her to see that, and all of us online can meet her. If not, I will move on to introducing our fabulous panelists today. So Melody, if you are able to introduce yourself, I would love that.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Melody Skeet, and I'm the regional coordinator in Central Region, and I'm really happy to be here to join everyone today in this important discussion, and really just looking forward to what Serena has to share, and just really thankful to my counterparts across the province for organizing such an important conversation and piece of work around grief. So thank you all to all the panelists that are here today. And thank you for everyone who showed up on a Monday morning.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Melody. I really appreciate that. And with that, and my gratitude to the Mental Health Foundation of Nova Scotia for helping us fund this work, I am overjoyed to introduce the fabulous Serena Lewis, who is a beautiful social worker and has been recognized by both the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers and the Canadian Association of Social Workers with awards as a consultant and educator and committed to the values of social change. Her career in Mi'kma'ki has been diverse in nonprofit, provincial, and federal systems. She has been a champion in each of these sectors, advocating for and with the people she engages. In 2018, Serena was awarded the Wesley and Janine Drudge Award for Health and Social Policy, as she has remained committed to asking the hard questions of systems, leaders, and herself. As a clinician who specializes in the field of dying, death, and grief, she has mentored, educated, and case consulted with teams locally, provincially, and nationally. A facilitator and committee participant on many various national groups, she has elevated the necessity of social justice in the end of her life. Her participation and activism in the Nova Scotia mass casualty tragedy has demonstrated that Canadians need to rethink how we live, die, and how grief and sometimes trauma intersects these experiences. With that, I will turn it over to Serena with my extreme gratitude and appreciation that we are all able to learn with her over the next 3 Mondays. So thank you, Serena, and take it over.
Thank you, Kristen. And I've been delighted watching all of the love kind of showing up every time one of these panelists are introducing themselves. So this is a collective approach today. Even though, yes, you are on mute, please, I'm following the chat here and very grateful to N for moderating as well throughout this, because we really want to hear from you. That's the most important. So respectfully, I often believe in many things. Maybe this comes from my palliative care experience in life, but I believe we need to start with the end in sight. And I often think that we forget and we kind of tack self-care on at the very end. So today we're going to start with our integration with really looking at ourselves first. For all of you, I have one minor little request. Well, maybe a couple. Please make sure that you're comfortable. Have a cup of coffee. Maybe you're putting your lunch beside you, but I'm going to ask you if you can also grab a piece of paper. And yes, old school, a pen, pencil, marker, whatever. And just to have that close by, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of reflection today. So I'm just going to ask everybody if they could take a minute and do that as well. So let's see if we can find our slides quickly. This is always the moment. How are we looking, N?
You look awesome. This looks fabulous.
We can see it. Step one, we're in. So again, I want to respectfully acknowledge my presence here today in Mi'kma'ki. I also want to acknowledge and want to go back to the fact that Tracy Shea and I have been working together for probably over a decade. And I was so disappointed she wasn't able to be here because, again, in a true acknowledgement to the hard work that, again, many people have contributed to kind of today being this next step. That's what we're going to call it, a next step. I think it's so important that we have had the ability to build relationships and to challenge ourselves and to work really hard and trying to learn and unlearn and do all of the things along the path. So I want to acknowledge that I wish Tracy could be here with us today. Hopefully she'll get to chime in later and be able to see some of these chats and the love that's sent to her as well. I also want to acknowledge a very rich opportunity that I had as I was doing some work alongside community members in Pictou Landing here in the province, and had a very surprising and delightful opportunity to be part of and to be asked to be part of a naming ceremony. And so as I continue to lean in and understand and work hard for my own actions around truth and reconciliation, I was very deeply touched to be actually part of the naming ceremony where an elder there at Pictou Landing actually acknowledged my name in Mi'kma'ki is Soaring Eagle. And I have always taken that to heart, probably more in the last couple of years than ever. And understanding sometimes the opportunity to be able to kind of soar and watch and learn. So I want to acknowledge my gratefulness and my appreciation, which has also led me to a beautiful opportunity in the last year that I have had the opportunity to step into teaching a trauma-informed grief education course in Canada with a beautiful group of new social workers on their way to our profession. And what is so meaningful is that we are doing this with a specialized group, a cohort. And what we are doing is we're doing and looking at trauma informed from an Indigenous and hybrid model not appropriating, but working really hard to make sure that we're looking at this from a very hybrid model of what we can learn from one another. So it has been probably one of the most richest opportunities that I've had in the last 12 months for sure, being part of this group. So today, as you're joining, I very much believe in holistic practice, and I want to acknowledge geographically, I've been watching kind of where people are chiming in from today, but I want to acknowledge today the physicality of where you may be today. Maybe some of you are at work and joining in from an office space. Some of you may be home working in a hybrid model. I want to acknowledge that we're all kind of spread throughout Mi'kma'ki, throughout Nova Scotia today. And I think that builds a context of community that's very rich for us today. Mentally, I think it's important that many of you may be joining in today and there may be multiple distractions, phones and other kinds of things. Maybe you're in your office. And I just want to again acknowledge wherever you are is important. And I want to thank you for being here today. Socially, I felt a wee bit teary as we got started today, just recognizing how much I missed so many. I see a lot of colleagues popping up, so I feel like this is a connection back. Feels like it's been a while since we've been able to convene like this, and so I'm very appreciative that socially that we're having this opportunity to be together today. Emotionally, I think it's important that we today acknowledge that this last couple of years has created a tremendous amount of pressure on all of you, on all of us in the health and social sectors. And I think it's so important to have opportunity to actually start with you that this is an inside-outside job. And so I want to say thank you from the deepest part of me for all of the work that each of you are doing in ways that have been so stressful and challenging. So I think about the people in Nova Scotia and the ways that we're intersecting to help support. So thank you for that. But emotionally, I hope that you're able to join us today, whether it's feeling like a Monday, that's a challenging Monday, or whether it's kind of the best restart for the week. Wherever you are, welcome. Also, spiritually, I think it's really important that we're joining together today, recognizing that some of us might be experiencing a deep sense of peace, and others of us on the call today may be having quite a difficult time in our own personal lives, and recognizing that it's been very challenging. So again, I really think it's important that we acknowledge from that place of holistic practice that your being here today means a lot. And I thank you for that. As in every session, I think that we have started talking about grief and trauma awareness. I think it's very important to really stop and think. Rachel Naomi Riemann is a beautiful soul who writes about the expectations about us being immersed in suffering and loss daily and not being touched by it. And she really validates the fact that this is really unrealistic. It's like walking through the water thinking that we're not going to get wet. So I hope today can be an opportunity for you to sit back and think about, and not just think, but kind of experience what this has been like as we're moving forward. As is the case in most of the education, and again, I like to think of this more as a supportive and educational lens today, not necessarily training, because I think we have so much wisdom here. My little slice is just a tiny slice into the wisdom that's in this group today. So may today be an opportunity for that praxis, for us to be able to take a bit of time to think about our action, but also have an opportunity to think about the experience of all of this and how we're turning that into insight. Whether you're a social worker on the call, a nurse on the call, a teacher, guidance, no matter your profession, I think we all have an opportunity to start to look at the insight about how this experience has shaped us and probably will shape the collective moving forward. So I want to acknowledge I've integrated a lot of photography, which has become very, very important to me. So again, an inside-outside job, I think it's really important for the things and finding those opportunities of how we ourselves are getting grounded through these very difficult times. So I offer you up some of the pictures that I've been taking on my walks as I'm doing some deep processing in life, especially over the last few years. And I want to start by acknowledging again some incredible material. And I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to read this book from Duran, Eduardo Duran. He talks about healing, and I'm going to give you the title of his book. It's called Healing the Soul Wound, and it's trauma-informed counseling for Indigenous communities. But what I really like, as I've been talking a little bit in our intro, that really this is today an opportunity for us to look at multiple ways of knowing. Many of you may come in with a mental health lens, maybe the physicality of how trauma and grief affect you, your clients, your patients, whatever your persons that you support. But today, I really like us to have opportunity to look at the multiple ways of knowing and how it's so important that we broadly look at the harmonious process of what healing can be like. So healing of the body, mind, and spirit is further compounded by the fact that the trauma occurs, again, at a personal, community, and collective level. And I think this is such an important place to start today, recognizing that we may be community leaders, but we are also community members. And I think as we're stepping into really exploring this, I think it's important that we stop to reflect upon the fact that we are really looking at healing body, mind, and spirit. So Duran challenges us to really call this and to really look at trauma as a soul wound. And as he has wrote very powerfully around Indigenous communities and what trauma counseling and trauma support looks like, I pay heed to the fact that I really have found that his writing, his work, has helped me shift my practice in really important ways. I want to acknowledge again the fact that we are standing, sitting, participating today on Mi'kma'ki, and it's so important to think about the impacts as we are all leaning in to understand more, but also to act more from the impacts of intergenerational trauma. And I think the fact that many of us who come from social perspectives, I think it's important that, again, we look at our own history and the interconnection of colonization, and the fact that we too have created harm in our processes, our policies, and the way that we have worked. So to me, today is a really big opportunity for us to start peeling away those veils, to understand more and more about how we are so interconnected in this, and recognizing, as Anne has said, colonization has affected all of us, but it is all of our responsibility to start to peel this away and really do the work that has impacted so many people. As well as intergenerational trauma, the impacts of residential schools here throughout this province, the impacts of racism, colonization here. It's important, as we're also looking across this province, that all of us are kind of coming into this call today with different levels of experience that we also have faced as professionals and people who live in communities. Again, we recognize that we've had many shared universal connecting points, but we've also had some very isolated and impactful issues that have happened along the way. So today I really want to kind of look at what has been the impact on us as professionals, people, as we're kind of pulling this away, to understand more. How will we look at trauma moving forward? How are we going to make sure that we're making space for grief, literacy, awareness, education as we continue the work? And I don't know about you, but I'm really struggling more and more with, I actually cannot tolerate it, to be quite honest, with people talking about getting back to normal. I, if anything, believe through this existential crisis that many people will speak about now, this is our opportunity to stand up and to make the changes that are necessary for us to move forward in a way that is a more collective healing path. So I'd like to be able to talk about that more today. So again,
can I interrupt for a second, Serena? I'm sorry. Many people are asking for the name of the book that you mentioned, that you said was transformative. And what we'll do is we'll try to send that to participants afterwards as well.
If it's okay, and what I will do when I have folks doing the activity, I will type it in here so everyone can have access to it, as well as a couple of other resources that I leaned on for the work today. So happy to
Wonderful.
share. Happy to share.
Wonderful. And I see here it says healing the soul wound.
That is it. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you.
And please, yes, any questions or comments that you would like to add. We want to make this as interactive as we possibly can throughout this webinar. So the other thing that I think is incredibly important to talk about is that as we know, the personal is political. We know that the hard work we're doing with individuals every day in your practice is very much interconnected with the intersectionality of a macro lens. So I think as we're looking at kind of over the next couple of weeks of time together, the work that we do one-on-one, I think is so valuable to really think about the land in which we live on. And thank you, En, for the real grounding exercise of understanding that we're all being impacted by colonization. And our job is really to continue to look at, and Duran would actually talk about the fact that this will become liberation as more we continue to push back and work with the decolonization of our area, our province, again, across this entire country. So what's happening on a micro lens is very much interconnected with the macro lens. And again, we're going to kind of get into family-centered and community practices next week. But I always like to kind of make sure that we're talking about how interconnected all of this work is today. And we know that some of the barriers that we really have to be able to deconstruct, and I'll talk a little bit more about these in a more in-depth way, but really to start to look at the biases, the prejudice, the racism, the oppression that occurs, that we allow some trauma and trauma awareness to be spoken about, but many others have been very much silenced. And I think that's had a profound impact on finding our literacy, finding our ability to share and talk and heal. So I want to keep looking at this next week. We'll get into this more and more. To ground us all today, I want to just kind of give us a snapshot on what I would consider grief to be. There are many multiple definitions in which you would probably use in your own practices, but to me, I see grief as probably the most natural and normal experience that any of us can have. We know it's universal. We know that everyone grieves. And has different rituals, all of those pieces come together. So it's a very global, universal experience, but it's also incredibly personal. And so I think that becomes a bit of the varied issue that we're in. And I think that to me is the common denominator that all of our practices, whether we work in healthcare, child welfare, SchoolsPlus, it doesn't matter what professional lens we work. If we work with people, we have a common denominator of working with trauma and working with grief. And to me, those are a given. But to me, they're also very highly disregarded in our systems to really look at what has been the impact of loss on our people that we support. So we know, and if we were to use the experience of COVID as a very global experience, we also know that if we come down to a macro level, how each country was impacted by COVID, very much differentiated. We saw the impacts of privilege, Western culture. We've also kind of looked at this from a meso lens and really looked at communities and how people handle public health and issues around vaccinations. And then when we get into more the micro level, we know that all of us have had some impact and kind of trying to process the different impacts of what that this whole pandemic has created. So if I could kind of expand on that definition a bit, grief actually, again, from a holistic lens, can cause physical pain. We know that. We hear people talking about the impacts of, eating too much versus not being able to eat, exercising versus not being able to move and feel frozen in state. We know that sleep has been disrupted for many people. So physicality is important when we think about grief. Emotionally, I think it's very important we look at grief, but not only through the sadness lens, which again, I think grief's been given a raw deal that we only look at it through sadness. I think it's all of our emotions. It's disappointment, it's fear, it's frustration, it's joy, it's all of the emotions all are impacted. So again, I may be sharing a beautiful story. Again, as we see we're edging closer into December, we start to see more emotionality around people's grief experience. So again, that can be sharing very intimate, beautiful parts of their past that are important and have brought people joy. It also can really instigate a lot of sadness, anger, fear. Socially, I think it's so important that we look at grief, and I think never before have we lived through an experience. Well, yeah, actually, I take that back. We've lived through many experiences on this call. Socially, we see the disruption that this whole experience has brought, our province, and in ways that we have kind of come together and ways that we've been divided. So socially, we know, again, there can be strengths, there can be challenges, cognitive, mental pain also. So I think we think about the fact that mentally, we can very much feel that we've, gotten into, making bread, which I think back to the first of the pandemic, that people were finding ways to cognitively process what was happening. And at other times we feel very much like we're in a fog, which I hear a lot of people talking about, and that we're feeling full, that our heads are feeling full, our bodies are feeling full, and our minds are definitely full. So we can see, again, both the strengths and the challenge cognitively and mentally. This is why I really love Duran's work about talking about the spiritual pain and talking about the soul pain that grief and trauma can actually bring people, communities, families, and again, at a very macro level, how do we address soul pain? And I think that's where we connect very much, and we'll get into in the next couple of weeks talking about different theoretical contexts, but it's why I lean a lot into this existential work of really looking at what that soul pain can also contribute in our healing as well. So again, the strengths and challenges. I also put in here organizational pain as a time that we're moving more and more into talking about and making sure we're making space for psychological safety in our workplaces, in our organizations. And I think for those of you on the call today that have recognized the challenges, whether you work in long-term care, whether you're working in one of our prison facilities here across the province, whether you're working in a group home, in a hospital, I think we've seen the impact of institutional care and how that organizational pain. I've talked in some of the work that I've been doing in the last couple of months. It's been really powerful to hear people in long-term care finally being able to start to talk about the moral distress. And I think that's an important part of this organizational system pain that we have worked through and are continuing to process right now at this stage. We know that this has been very difficult, and for many of us on the front line, we have very much tried to kind of help support people through this. And now it's almost like the thaw is occurring of kind of how this has been for each of us. So we'll get into talking a bit more about that, but I wanted to kind of just again reiterate the fact that, again, where I see, and I really never like to pathologize grief. I think it is the most natural, normal experience we'll ever have. The thing is, I'm not convinced that we've got a good narrative and discourse to be able to talk about these different levels of pain and strength. Now, again, we'll see many definitions of trauma. We'll probably have lots of people on this call today who are doing very trauma specific. So again, there's a difference between trauma specific work. So again, being very well versed in theoretical and techniques that people work with trauma versus all of us having a very broad understanding and knowledge base of what does it mean to be trauma informed. To me, this is no longer a luxury, it's a necessity throughout this province that we really need to build more. So I hope, if nothing else today, this excites you to think about what else do I need to understand about trauma informed to help my practice and the way that I work alongside people, myself, and kind of look at systemic change. So another book that I will share later details on, I tried to make sure I had everything beside me, is Becoming Trauma Informed, another textbook that I have been working alongside. So Poole and Greaves will say that trauma describes experiences that may overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. And when I stop and think about that sentence in itself, I would like to ask if there's anyone on this call that has not been impacted by trauma at some point in their life. Again, a reflective exercise. This is about building insight and understanding who we are as helpers in the field. So again, trauma describes experiences that may overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. We know that traumatic events experienced in early life, such as abuse, neglect, witnessing violence, and disrupted attachments, can be devastating, and have attended some beautiful seminars, webinars from some of my colleagues across the province on really exploring more and understanding about adverse childhood experiences and how important those are in the work that all of us do. Equally challenging can be later in life experiences that become out of our control. And those can be violence, those can be accidents, natural disasters, war, incarceration, or sudden expected loss. So they talk about all of these things as being impactful to our psyches, mind, soul, and body. These events can undermine or damage people's sense of safety. And I read a beautiful quote the other day about the assumptions we make about people's safety. And I can't impress on all of us enough that creating spaces to be psychologically safe will be the most important work I think that all of us have ahead of us in the next upcoming years, to really challenge ourselves about spaces that are trauma informed and psychologically safe for people to be able to share and to kind of do the processing that they're looking and needing maybe to do. So these events can undermine or damage people's sense of safety, self and self-efficacy, as well as ability to regulate emotions and navigate relationships. And I think for any of us, if we were to turn on social media at any given point today, we would see the impacts of trauma in our society right now. We know that people are, again, and have been for a very long time, impacted by a sense of safety, about finding their voice, finding their own path through these things, being able to talk about it. And again, we start to see the dividedness. And I think back to the beginning of the pandemic, I attended an impactful seminar from the World Health Organization. And I remember there was a person there from the spiritual care community, and he made a comment because, again, from Europe, he was telling us that here in North America, in Turtle Island, he was talking about the impact of what the pandemic was doing in Europe. And he said, I would love to tell you all that this is going to bring out the best in people. But he said, unfortunately, that is not our lived experience right now. And again, it was kind of that moment of a bit of foreshadowing that made me nervous. And I think we can actually recognize that we have seen a lot come to the surface, a lot of division in our communities, a lot of division in our families, a lot of division in our workplaces. But I think it's kind of working with those tensions and conflicts and looking at what does psychological safety mean, and being able to come forward and being more trauma informed to understand and listen to one another. We recognize that everyone has had some soul wound throughout this very challenging parts of the last couple of years and in our history. Now, what I also think about universality is the fact that we have really, it's quite amazing to me that our bodies, when we think about the physicality of all of this, is that we have been really graciously given one brain and one heart. And very fascinating. I think we all kind of share that in common here today. Thing is, I think we don't realize that as we're shifting gears between our personal self, our professional self, and our private self, that we have been doing a tremendous amount of work trying to integrate all of what has been happening. So for everyone who's talking, I mean, I don't know about you, but multitasking to me has become incredibly painful. So much, in fact, that I'm really pulling away more and more, knowing that, again, my brain is trying to kind of integrate everything that's been going on. So when we think about what we're doing at work, and we know that our workspaces, our work practices, all of those things have changed so dramatically, we know that, again, cognitively, we're doing a lot of work trying to process, what does this mean? And how do we continue to apply all this? The thing is that we're all human beings as well in this helping profession. And I think we come with our own personal experiences that, again, and I'm glad that we're moving away from this kind of thing that we used to think that we could leave things and compartmentalize, because I'm not sure that that ever was as easy as we'd like to think it was. But what we do need to acknowledge is that our brain, going through these trauma experiences in various ways, have impacted our capacity to kind of multitask. So I'm hoping that today that this can be a gentle reminder that what your brain has been doing to integrate your professional and personal life back and forth has been a lot of work. Hence the reason that, again, we come back to this to think about our private lives. And to me, that's the part when we're not navigating our friendships and we're not navigating our family members and our pets and all of the things, the volunteer things that we do. But at night, maybe at the end of the day, when we're trying to settle in and privately trying to process, what does all of this mean? And I think it's so incredibly important that we have to have this ability. And I'm a mom, and I remember my adult son said to me one day, you know, I'm finding it hard on the weekend. I find that I'm getting lazy. And I said, you know, what a terrible narrative to be putting on us at this point. And I said, what about restoration? What about kind of rest? Knowing that no matter what our jobs are, we're working really hard to professionally and personally kind of keep all of this going. So privately, when these spaces come, how incredibly important it is to be able to do this action reflection work. And to me, the reflection requires a lot of us if we have gone through a very tough couple of years. So what we might have needed for self-compassion and self-care 3 years ago, please afford yourself the fact that your minds have been through a lot. And I think having this ability to kind of slow things down. So even joining today, I deeply appreciate that. I hope that this can be one of these spaces to kind of let some of this settle for a bit. Equally important, our hearts have been through a tremendous amount. And again, we have one heart. It's one of those muscles that we, you know, I think we take it for granted. So we start to think about moral distress. We start to think about compassion and fatigue and all of those terms. But what does it mean that we've witnessed what we have at a heartfelt state? And again, I want to come back to your professional lens. I would say anyone who has worked in a social and healthcare setting over the last couple of years has either had to do things that they thought they would never have to do, have witnessed things they never thought they would have to witness. And I think we have to be able to stop and talk about the moral injury as we got into these fields. And if I were to ask many of you, as I'm traveling around talking with different workspaces about kind of the impact of all of this on your own hearts. And it was only a couple of months ago, I had this beautiful person talk to me and said, you know, Serena, what's going to happen when we stop and realize just what we asked people in our care to do? When we stop and think about isolating people who are already isolated and lonely, he said, even speaking this, he said, is so hard to acknowledge. And he said, you know, I think about us in leadership roles and you know, who would have ever thought our systems would be pushed to this tension of keeping people alive versus kind of leaving them in ways that we thought we would never have to. And he said, as I'm trying to kind of pull this apart, and I was so touched by his honesty. And I think it's so important, again, that we stop to talk about this, because they said what you're doing is articulating really deeply what this level of moral distress has meant to you. You're observing, you're feeling this. And to me, by being able to talk about it, we're being able to start to do the healing process. And I hope that today we'll see that tension in kind of all of the things that we've had to suppress, both mentally and heartfelt through this process, I think has taken its toll. So I appreciate, and I'm glad the validation feels important, because I sincerely mean this. And I don't sincerely mean this just for each of you. I think about the people that you work with and how much they've been pushed personally, professionally, and privately. I jokingly say no one ever wants to stand beside me or behind me at the Sobeys checkout, because I sincerely ask people, how has this been for you? And it's so important just to be able to acknowledge that with people, regardless of what our personal, professional, and private lives look like. Because to me, this is our way through, is being able to validate and acknowledge each other. And as I'm saying this, I also acknowledge, and I want to acknowledge the fact that I thought the last couple of years that things would slow down, but what I have learned is that life continues to become quite tumultuous. And I shared with the panel and want to kind of validate and acknowledge that we had hoped to do this session much earlier this fall, but my home was one of the ones destroyed in the hurricane. So I've actually resided in 5 different homes in the last 2 months. So I continue to keep learning more and more again, and asking the hard questions of myself. Am I embodying this? Am I thinking about how hard my own brain and my own heart are working? Because I think that is our, not only to honor ourselves, but our own responsibility as well. Thank you to the person here. We were put in positions we never expected to experience. I think that's so important that we can take a moment to acknowledge. And to me, this slide is so important because I think it's powerful to recognize our bodies, minds, and souls have been doing a whole lot of work. So taking those opportunities to rest, hence the reason I'm putting some of my photography in here, because that's been really important to me, as taking pictures that I acknowledge both the pain, but I'm also acknowledging the beauty. And so as we're all walking around in the streets, in the malls, in our hiking pals, wherever it is that you go to do your own reflection work, I think it's important that we're holding space to recognize that there's been deep beauty, but also deep pain over the last couple of years, and in our historical context of really looking deeper. But what I find interesting, even as a group of people who come together today, how much have we been able to reveal about the impacts of all of this on ourselves? To me, that's a very important piece, because as we continue to kind of support other people, there needs to be safe spaces for us to really talk about this moral distress. I'm a very big supporter in the fact that I don't think burnout is on us as individuals. I think, again, organizationally and societally, we really need to look at how do we reconstruct the way that we work and live and practice to keep supporting our own beauty and pain through these processes. So I jokingly have told many people that at one point during the pandemic, I had emailed our premier at the time, and I also emailed the head of public health, and I suggested to them that I have appreciated the hard work that they're doing, and again, respectfully acknowledge that this pandemic has created a tumultuous overload on probably all of our systems. But yet where I saw that we looked very deeply through a microscope to understand this pandemic, I challenged and continue to challenge that I think we've lost sight of that telescope. And we're seeing levels of distress more and more in our communities, our families, and our own sense of personhood. That wasn't just about that pandemic or about wearing a mask or getting a vaccination. It was really telescopically, how is our society doing? How is our communities doing? How are we doing as a group of helpers? And so even in the work that I've done with the public inquiry over the last couple of years, I continue to say, telescopically, we have got to look at our helpers in all fashions, to be able to say, you know, how are we doing as we're continuing to try to keep making space for people as they're going through their distress. So I come back and vacillate between the fact that it is a microscopic lens of looking at a pandemic through a medical model. I think we had to be very careful, and I'm not quite sure that we were, as we have seen telescopically a lot of harm throughout this province. So before we started to wear our masks, I look at this work from Robin Ord. She talked about grief in our society becoming performative. We do what we think we're supposed to do, often automatically, and we get rewarded with positive feedback. If we behave in this prescriptive way, we get better and we will get over our grief. And I love her narrative and being able to push back to talk about this performative analysis of the way we grieve. And for many of you, you may be tired of hearing me talk about the fact that one of the things that scared me the most was our hashtag of being Nova Scotia Strong. I've articulated this in many ways in my writing, in interviews that I did. I was really concerned about the narrative of being Nova Scotia Strong. And I look at some of the research that has come out of mass events, and they talked a lot about stoicism being one of the biggest challenges for us to be able to grieve and to be able to talk about how these experiences intersect. So again, challenging these notions of being performative. And next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about the styles of grief that we start to see coming out. But I think we've really perpetuated this idea of stoicism and strength. And one, again, that I come back to really push myself and ask myself the hard questions. Am I subscribing to this notion of trying to be stoic and strong? I have been brought to my knees throughout this. And if I can't acknowledge that, if we as a collective, as helpers can't acknowledge this, how do we find our way through this? So I think it's important that I really believe that getting rid of this prescriptive analysis about pathologizing the way that we lean into understanding how trauma affects all of us. And that to me is incredibly normal, to know that the experience of this pandemic alone has really shaken our ability to cope. So I push back, I challenge. I think it's important we think about getting over this is not in the cards. We don't get around it. We can't get under it. Really, for us to start to process the impacts of our colonized history, of our colonized today, of the impacts of this pandemic, of the impacts throughout this province in multiple intersecting ways that you each have experienced trauma and grief. I think there's no getting around, over, or under it. I think we have to kind of find that ability to collectively go through. So some of this work we do on our own. It's a very private, personal. But again, I think if we keep this all in the background, how are we finding a path forward? So I think there's a very collective piece to this work. It's interesting. I'm actually going to ask you all for a little bit of time now with that paper and, that pencil, pen, marker, whatever you have. I'm going to ask you to do a little exercise here that I have found in the work that I've been doing with lots of teams has been very thought-provoking for people. Not only thought-provoking, but almost a felt sense of what has this been like? So on your paper, and we're going to talk a little bit about creating a map through this, but to me, we cannot start to create a map until we've explored our territory. And I think that's part of systems pushing us forward without really recognizing, I don't think that we're the same people. I know I'm not the same person. I've been changing, and it's not about overcoming this. It's really, who am I becoming through this process? But the thing is, if we don't take a moment to respectfully acknowledge, where has this been? What has this been like for us? How do we know what our maps need to look like? So at this point, I'm going to ask everyone, I'm going to actually play some music, and I hope that it will resonate for you as well. But on the paper, what I'm going to ask you to do is, in your own way, it can be words, it can be a beautiful diagram. I'm going to ask you to show, and again, we're not going to have to share these, but I would like you to talk about, what has it been like for you since January 2020 to November 2022. So again, I'd like you to just look at, what is your territory like? And I'd like you to remember this from a personal, a professional, and a private lens. So I am going to put some music on, if everything works well. I'm going to mute for a second, and I'm just going to ask you to work on that while and then at the end of the song, we'll reconvene. I hope you enjoyed that song. Twin Flames actually came to Truro, and on Truth and Reconciliation Day, I went to their concert, and I thought how fitting for a hybrid model discussion today and multiple ways of knowing. Again, they were recognized for the work that they did with Gord Downey and the Tragically Hip, and the remake of Grace 2 that was acknowledged. So I put the title, and I had to be very careful throughout that I wasn't singing along because I remembered that you were all there. So I am just finishing putting the books here. And then I would like to talk a little bit about, there we go. These are some of the books that I used to put together today's presentation. So please feel free to jot those down if they feel like they resonate for you. I would like to kind of open up to talk a little bit about the impacts of that exercise. Were you able to do some kind of diagram, a verbal, a picture, whatever that felt like for you that was important, I guess, to acknowledge what has the last couple of years through this time of a pandemic been like for you? So again, I'm just wondering if people in chat could just kind of, what did you discover without having to disclose parts of your personal story? What was it like to see both the, yeah. Thank you. So fear of the unknown. Huge chunk of your chat, right. I really appreciate, I was talking to somebody the other day about our memories. And I think it really stands to reason that we as a group of helpers have also been impacted by this decision fatigue, emotional labor, more complex. And I appreciate, again, I think from a self-compassion, and if I lean in on the work that, and I'll bring a little bit more of her work in as well, that sometimes self-compassion is being able to put something into action to look at this. And I'm going to ask you, because this is really coming fast now, could you just kind of give some overview of what you're seeing here? I'd like to really take a few minutes to honor this and appreciate the connecting point of this.
Absolutely. So there's some beautiful things. Fear of the unknown, recognizing a huge chunk of my timeline that I can't remember, very life-changing forever, and loss, how scared I've been. My past trauma has taught me to just muddle through. I don't think I realized that was what I was doing. It's more complex than I realized once I write it all down at once. Emotional labor, decision fatigue, managing multiple realities and navigating conflicting and contradictory truths, minimizing our personal experiences to allow us to be present for others, prioritizing what is in and out of our control. Time is still blurry, trying to be everything for everyone, how unbalanced and blurred emotions have become. The mask is a good symbol, feeling stifled, guilt, trying to balance needs for socialization with protecting your loved ones, isolation, introspection. The grinding of time has been distorted, sadness for the children and youth who I feel have lost a significant sense of belonging through their isolation, swimming in deep water with no view of a safe shoreline, isolation, profound sadness, guilt over choosing my safety over patient care, grateful to have some tools to help myself and others, frustrated at the lack of tools to help on a system societal level, running on autopilot, overwhelming and isolating, loneliness, isolation, uncertainty, so much division, both personally and professionally. I drew a map of an unknown journey, grief and loss to family relationships yet to be connected, exhaustion from shifting from one new direction to another, crisis to crisis, finding new pathways, There's like so many beautiful things here. I created a word salad of feelings and thoughts. It was a bit scary seeing it down on paper. Transition, how I minimize until the writing is in front of me, how scared I've been. The loneliness factor, the sadness, the fear of our future, feelings of hopelessness are still massive. Memory loss and depression, accepting that things are different than I expected. Fatigue, blaming myself, a lot of beating myself up for not being able to do what I used to do, the shock of how quickly we abandoned others, fatigue, so tired, ups and downs, similarities and differences in personal and professional lives, loss, being stuck, overwhelmed, chaotic. There's just inner resilience, acknowledging the wholeness of life, learning to trust the new, deep compassion, deep connection to the land and how it supports us. I planted trees, I hope, for the planet and all of our relations. So ending on a note of hope. There's a lot more though. And for all of you watching on YouTube, this is why it's so good to be here live to see the beautiful chat conversations.
Thank you. And thank you for even in a collective space of this magnitude to be able to show some of our intimacy, I think, which is important, our vulnerability, but our honesty. To me, this is the most important part, that this is an inside-outside job and we too have been affected. To me, I think this is the important part. Silence to me is the great oppressor in this. It always has been. But where do we have the opportunity to really talk about the moral distress and the challenges that all of this has brought to us as a collective? So I would love to, at the end, go back and take a look at all of the comments, because I agree. I think it's important that we're able to start to express the challenges that all of this has brought for us. I want to remind each of you that diagram. I would encourage you, and I would never give a tool that I haven't done myself and continue to work on myself, because I remember that we're writing history right now. And I remember as a woman, as a mother, as a social worker, in all of the different intersectional ways that my life unfolds, that one day I'm going to look back and think about how we did come through this challenging, incredible time. And again, it helps to keep me grounded to think about the things, again, the beauty and the pain. And I think it's important that we're finding those spaces to be able to explore both of those things. But also as a collective of helpers, I want to go back to saying, I don't want us to go back to normal. I want us to break through the barrier of this and being able to be as real as we possibly can, to know that we too have been affected maybe by vicarious experiences of trauma along our professional lens, but also kind of the last few years of trying to power through this. And I think about all the terminology we kind of put out there. I think it's important that we stop and we think about kind of, just as you're saying, this resiliency has come also with a cost. And so while sorry, Anne, you have something.
And there's actually a question exactly about that. Since we're talking about pathologizing grief and stoicism with Nova Scotia Strong, how do we navigate the new prolonged grief disorder diagnosis in the DSM, especially in this present moment? So I'm wondering if that's, yeah.
Whoever actually wrote that, I thank you deeply, because I've often said that the legacy that I would love to leave behind in my own practice is that we really could shake that entire diagnosis piece up, because that scares me right now. And again, this is the gift that I believe that we, and those of you on the call who are social workers, to me, the current state is the social injustice that I see around grief and trauma. And the fact that we are getting really, and that's why, I mean, if I were to ask all of you, do you feel like you have lived through a soul wound? The last 2 years, maybe your entire lifespan based on your own history? Thank you to the person who immediately said yes. The soul wound makes sense. So again, when we pathologize a collective soul wound, what does that do? So I think we're answering our questions, and we'll continue to keep exploring these over the next couple of weeks together. My concern is for a soul wound of the magnitude that we've been experiencing with colonization, with a pandemic, with multiple intersecting trauma experiences. Where will we collectively start to find our healing? So I want to come back to this understanding of the map and the territory. And the picture here of the trail is actually beautiful, the Mi'kma'ki Trail that I walk on. For any of you who live close to Debert, it has been a very grounding place for me as well as one of the homes that I lived on the beach. So I'm often taking time to stop and look at my territory. If we were to think today that we were on an airplane, and remember when you used to be on an airplane and you could watch that little map, and let's just let on we're going someplace a little bit warm today. And we know that if we were flying and we were kind of paying attention to that map, but if we were to get out of the airplane and walk the territory, we know that it would be dense. It would take us a lot longer. It would come with all kinds of challenges, some beautiful scenery. What you've created in your diagram to me is the territory. And I think until we actually take that time for action and reflection, how do we understand our territory? How do we become intentional as individuals, as helpers in these fields, within our own families, really starting to look at what the territory looks like? And to me, if we don't start with the end in sight, that a territory of this climate and the density that we have right now, how do we actually look at creating a map? So to me, putting a map before exploring the territory doesn't make any sense. I think we have to acknowledge the soul wounds before we can start to move into what will we need to collectively heal, to individually heal, to make spaces in our communities to create new ways of kind of thinking and knowing and sharing those knowledge pieces. Now, I often, for instance, if I were working with a particular population, I would talk about your map that you created, your territory of showing the last 2 years. But if I were to ask you for all of the people that you support, and if that's a group of students, if you work in long-term care, if you're working in a palliative care, if you were to actually ask each person that you have met and their families, if they could draw you the diagram of their territory for the last couple of years, then we start to see that every time we're walking into our communities, that we have a lot of dense territory that we've not been able to name. And I think that becomes a part for me that helps keep me grounded when I'm seeing all kinds of reactions and dividedness. It comes back to that iceberg of really not knowing people's territories, not knowing the trauma loads that they've been carrying without having any ability to discuss it, to share it, to support all of those pieces. So as I can start to look at my territory, I can start to become more intentional. Is it, and again, if we start to intersect some of the self-compassion, is it rest I need? Is it a walk I need? Is it a boundary I need? Do I need to write, advocate? All of these have become very important to me through my own territory of kind of trying to figure out, when we look back over this time, who have I been? What have I contributed? And what have I had to withdraw and do my own healing work as well? So I think the intersectionality of us as helpers is incredibly important as we launch into this over the next couple of weeks together. And I really love Meredith Parfay's writing about who we were before cannot be resurrected. Grief and trauma aren't about stretching and then regaining our original shape. They're about being reformed into what some grief experts call the dynamic shift from life 1 to life 2. So an interesting way, again, to really think about the fact that we will not go back to the people that we were, collectively, I guess, back to January 2020. We've lived through an experience that we are trying to become through. So while we're trying to overcome the challenges of all of this, we're also really doing some of that deep dive existential work. And what I really appreciate in some of the work that Duran, and I want to share with you a story that he wrote in his book that has really captured me. So I think about all of this unattended trauma and grief that's in our society, in our communities. And I think about the fact that he actually uses a metaphor that he shares Viktor Frankl, some of Viktor Frankl's, which I follow a lot of Viktor Frankl's work, but he talked about trauma actually feeling sometimes like a vampire bite. And he talks about it coming at some of the darkest points of our life where something has occurred or happened. But he said what we have to think about is this internalized oppression of being not able to work through and process some of this. And again, we think about the fact that trauma can beget trauma. And we know that if we don't stop to really look at the impacts of these vampire bites, and again, I use his terminology in this, but he talked about Viktor Frankl acknowledging that when the Holocaust survivors were liberated at the end, he talked about some people really just wanting revenge. And he said he could really understand at that point what a vampire bite feels like, because people lash out with this anger and fear. And I thought, what a powerful way to describe how unsafe people feel inside, and that sometimes that is the accessible emotion. And I don't want to validate more trauma, but I think it is part of that whole process. So his discussion about a vampire bite and how trauma begets trauma, how important this is for us to really start to think about creating safety. So trauma affects people's sense of self and safety in the world. And again, it affects their confidence about accessing and continuing to receive assistance from service providers. And I think this really helps us to understand and work with being more trauma informed, and how important this is for tools and techniques, but more of this deep understanding about a soul wound that has happened to us and has happened to other people, that sometimes I think it's important, and we know this from the work we do alongside people, that sometimes our trauma has been so suppressed, our history has been so suppressed, that sometimes these are the hardest people that we have to be able to connect with. And sometimes that's ourselves. Are we being able to connect with other people to talk about the impacts? So looking at this on a broad scale to me is really, really important in the time frame we're in right now, because again, this is our opportunity to look at how do we revisit, how do we look at more systemic oppression, and how we're pathologizing what people's experiences are. So how do we start to do more of this praxis work? And we know that words matter. Words have power. We did a complete exercise in our social work class, really deconstructing, does victim feel okay? And for a lot of people, they don't want to be classified as a victim. And so we have to really pull apart how our trauma language, how, are we talking about students' behavior, or are we talking about the fact that they too have had been impacted by adverse childhood experiences? So we have to keep pulling apart the language in 2022 to really start to understand that this is not a one size fits all. And again, there's universality, but there's also a very personal and cultural connection here, and that our words do influence and actually can be so much more oppressive to people. I've often talked to people about the difference between grief and depression, and how much we have relied on depressive language. We look at some of the work around Kubler-Ross, who has been a pioneer in this work, but again, much of her terminology around denial and those kinds of things, you'll hear, I've talked a lot about these, and we'll get into this more in the next week or two, but our words have power. And I think our literacy around being trauma informed, I think we've looked at trauma through a lens, and I have been very frightened to see through the public inquiry how much we've really deconstructed the significance of what trauma informed actually means. As I sat in the inquiry watching this experience in front of me, I followed up to say there's so many actions that were there that were not trauma informed. And I think it's important that, you know, our classrooms, our offices, our families, our communities, we have this opportunity now to really start to look at how do we look at soul wounds and how do we move ahead? And I appreciate someone saying here again, we do not use victim perpetrator language at your work. And that's the thing that's important, is that sometimes we slip into terminology that is incredibly offensive to other people. So our words have power when we're building psychological safety. And it's not for us to really think, you know, and I think back to experiences in working in grief and loss and people talking about, you know, please don't say, who did I lose? Because I didn't lose anybody. So we have to be so open to learning more. And that to me is where I think it's powerful to have opportunity for praxis. I think there's a question. So, and I'm going to just stop.
Yeah, I don't see any. Oh, I see now. Wait, hold on. Sorry. Lorraine, can you type your question, Lorraine? All right, I'm going to allow you to talk. Lorraine, if you want to ask your question. I don't know if you meant to raise your hand, actually, since you're not speaking.
We don't want to, yeah, we don't want to put you on the spot. I just didn't want to continue going if there was something.
Lorraine?
Sorry. Yes, sorry, Serena. It goes back to your beginning quote now. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wondered what John C. Maxwell is best known for. He's a social worker, I'm assuming, but I don't know anything about him. So
John Maxwell does a lot of leadership education. So as I've been doing a lot of research over the years and working with leaders and managers, I really believe that insight piece. So he talks a lot about that as an important part of our leadership.
All right, thank you.
To me, as we're building and recreating and really examining the depth of our territory, I think it's important as we lean on research out of Australia too. I mean, they talk a lot about death and grief literacy. And what I really like is the question becomes, how do we increase levels of participation? How do we really look at the words, the literacy? How do we make it accessible to be able to talk about grief? How do we start to push back on this level of stoicism? And again, I've often said, if we had have went with Nova Scotia courage, I probably would have felt better. But strength to me during this time has become very oppressive. And again, I worry about it silencing people. So they talk about how we increase levels of participation and social change. And again, how do we co-produce, collaborate, and empower together? One of the things that I continued as I have, again, lived through this mass casualty is really the significance of people talking for us and not with us. And so coming from a rural-based community, knowing our norms, knowing kind of what trust means and where trust hasn't been comfortable, I think it's so important that we needed to co-produce, we needed to collaborate, and we needed to feel some sense of empowerment with the affected communities. And we hear that over and over again from the people who have experienced death through this mass casualty. As one example, I was talking at one point to some of the people who were out protesting, and I was really taken back by the level of fear when I approached them. And I asked, like, is it okay if I come over to speak to you? And they said, you know, what's really distressing, and this was just this past spring, they said, we're so distraught by the amount of people who have drove by, blew the horn, and literally told us to get the F over it. And I think, oh my goodness, like, and again, so their fear was, what was I coming over to them in their protest to be able to talk? This is shocking to me that we are not really listening. And maybe I shouldn't be shocked, but the fact is, how do we continue? And if we look at true reconciliation, it's not up for us to tell people. how to go through their healing. It's up for us to listen and to look at various frameworks of healing, and not that it's a one size fits all. And for those of us who subscribe and are passionate about cognitive behavioral therapies, those are not always. And again, this is part of kind of what we were seeing, is how do we look at hybrid models that that kind of bring together those oral stories and how people are affected. But as well, how are we also bringing empirical evidence? So participatory research to me is incredibly important during this time. And how do we work together to look at what it is that people are looking for, and how do we rebuild trust? So this comes again back to the point that so many people, I think, are kind of, there's this internalized oppression that is happening now, that we're kind of holding all of this and this collective wounding within our culture. And so as we continue to keep using models, again, that are not inclusive of people and their voices, and they can't be seen, sometimes these things are not helpful and they're actually causing more harm. And we know that from a profession that has participated in harm, how much it's so important for us to continue to do the work that we need to do. I often say good intentions are not enough. So back to Ord, she talks a lot in her research again about, she compares, and I really love the narrative about a counterculture look at grief. And she published this paper in 2009. But she, and again, some of my colleagues in Montreal are currently doing a lot of research right now on the impacts of tattoos and grief. And what I really pull from this is, again, a counterculture way that this is not about stoicism. It is not about being silent. It's about suggesting that grief is permanent and it's lifelong, and maybe it needs to become visible. Traditionally, it's made a way of making people feel uncomfortable and uneasy. And I think there used to be an expectation to cover it up, tidy it up, sanitize it, and make it fit into the right box. So she talks, and I've carried this paper with me for years, because I really appreciate the fact that she's talking about how we embody it on our skin, that grief is visible and it is permanent. And the experiences of our soul wounds are ours to be able to kind of narrate and understand and come to make meaning of. So it's okay that our grief is messy, visible, and beautiful as well. They're part of our stories as individuals and as collective members. So I think it pushes back on all of this internal silencing and aggression that I think starts to really unravel our own ability to validate our own stories as being important. And I've often done exercises when I'm with people in person, just to talk a little bit about your own tattoo and kind of what kind of meaning, was it a significant event, a person, an experience that you had in life? And I would say probably 98% of the time people say, absolutely, like this is something I want to always remember. Thank you for sharing that link. So again, I come back to understanding that we have to kind of keep looking through the telescope and understanding the multiple ways of knowing. And I think about the medicine wheel and all of the work. And Duran talks so much about this, again, from moving from a place of narrating, from psychologizing trauma, into really looking at this spirituality and the spiritualizing. So where does this soul wound? And I appreciate this idea of us moving into holistic practices in a much bigger way as individuals and being more intentional, but also as the collective way we're working with people. Probably one of the big ways that I really love to do group work when we're working alongside grief. To me, the job ahead of us is, again, even being able to verbalize your own experiences as mourners, being able to talk about what the last couple of years have been like in a very, very quick and minor way. But I encourage all of us to really take time with that diagram. If you're a journaler, to actually do some writing. or even being able to share with your family or friends or a colleague to, what has this been like for you? And being able to offer that space to say, can we share? What has this been like for each of us? To me, this is a big part of kind of breaking that silent mold and the stoicism that I think has been really holding us back. And Amy Edmonston, again, she does some work, again, around psychological safety. She talks about silence rarely announcing itself, and the moment passes and no one is the wiser except the person who held back. And I think that this is incredibly important when we're setting in meetings and we're setting in our workplaces, even today, feeling that are we holding back when we have something to contribute, when we have something to share. So I think, again, the silence to me becomes this internalized aggressiveness that it concerns me about how we're moving through this time frame, and just to kind of keep pushing on and knowing that our caseloads are getting more complex, situations, resources, all of those things. I think, to me, when I can start to look through the territory, I know that sometimes I don't want to speak, but sometimes I feel like it's important. And I know I had the most amazing manager through the mass casualty, and who offered, she said, like, how do you want to be through this? Like, what do you feel? And I said, for me, I'm concerned as I live through this. I don't want to look back and know that I was silent in this, because I know looking ahead 5 years, coming back 5 years, I want to be someone who has at least tried to use my voice in the best way that I could. That has not come without consequences. But again, I know that is true for all of us. So Duran also will talk about the fact that again, there's a relationship that we're actually making with the source of our pain. And I was out one day on a very cold day, and if any of you love to drive by blueberry fields in October or November, they're quite intricate and stunning. So, but I think it's so important as I'm driving through a community that's been ripped apart, literally, from impacts of trauma. I think that, to me, is that existential sense of understanding what is happening. And sometimes it's nature that keeps us grounded. So again, coming back to that soul pain, I'm looking around to say what's keeping us grounded, that the world is still going on as we're trying to deconstruct what is happening around us and within us. Viktor Frankl talks about that pause between reaction and response. And again, one of the things that I would continue to say, even through the impacts, and for those of you who may be impacted as well from Hurricane Fiona, it's that moment that I see us repeating again. Are we being reactive or are we being responsive? And I had the pleasure of attending a conference just before Fiona in New York City. And it was a group who have been meeting from, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Voices, a Center for Resilience. And actually it was started with a social worker who experienced the death of her son through the vicious attacks on 9/11. And she's been a tremendous supporter, and somebody that I really have admired the fact that she stood up through this whole painful episode and created these spaces and groups and opportunity for people to come together to heal. I think it is about making sense of what's happening. And what I appreciated is that here we are, and I was 21 years past 9/11 that I was in attendance at this memorial event. And it's just as important today as it was on the day that 9/11 occurred. And to me, that's what's important, is that we have to keep building response plans. And it's not about becoming silent and quiet over what's occurred. It's really finding spaces to recognize that this is a long-term response. And that really, to me, is where Nova Scotia could really advance in understanding that we are looking at where does trauma and grief belong in this province. Will we keep it hidden? Will we keep it silent? Or will we work with it in understanding that these last few years in our history in its entirety, we need to keep challenging this. So again, existential, this is kind of the whole part of understanding that we don't overcome, we're becoming. And I hope that it's able to deepen our experience. And I think that's why I really resonate with so much of Viktor Frankl's work. As someone who's lived through an incredible trauma, I think about Gabor Mate's honesty about his own lived experience. If any of you've had the opportunity to watch The Wisdom of Trauma, I was so captured by his partner's discussion about what it's like to live with him, and understanding that he has these soul wounds, but that's also a part of him. So again, not negating and helping to understand what is happening inside of people, what's happening inside of us as a collective. These are really important as we're working with soul wounds and trauma on our own personal experiences as helpers and people, but also in understanding it with others. So I wanted to include some very powerful examples of kind of ways that people are becoming and finding ways to navigate their soul wounds on a collective. And I want to honor a local woman I've had the pleasure of meeting who's just recently published her own book. I think about Every Child Matters and how we're really trying to understand and become much more aware of how we're navigating and understanding the impacts of residential schools and what they've done. I think about the power of going and attending a powwow and being completely moved by ritual and meaning and dance, and the liberation of coming through, again, holding space for the beauty and the pain. So I want to be able to reflect that there's so many ways possible. I think about our Black Lives Matter and how we're moving through to understand there's been huge amounts of oppression and pain. But I also think that it's like Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. says, I think that our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. So I think inadvertently, he has really taught us a lot about the impact of silence and how that can destroy us moving forward and healing. Recently, again, I think about local artists and authors. Again, a good friend of mine, Sherry Fitch, wrote a book after her son died in a very tragic way. Through poetry. And recently I was gifted this book in my own moccasins, which is with an incredible first person voice, again, about what it's been like to live through the impacts of colonization. So again, I think it's important when we're working with trauma and grief that we recognize both the beauty and the pain, and finding out the different ways that people creatively are processing. I wanted to also include the whole idea around this, and I come back to the whole idea of public tragedies, and I think about ways, and I'm preparing to speak at a conference nationally on from an emergency management process, how we handled this. So myself and the mayor here in the county have been asked to be keynote speakers, and I want people to understand that while we may have been showered, and it comes back to that whole idea of keeping the casseroles coming, as communities are trying to get their feet under them and come through all of this, that they are still in a tremendous amount of pain, even though we've dismantled the flowers and the public acknowledgements. So I want to come back to understanding that when public tragedies occur, they do affect and create grief and trauma. And I think it's important that that doesn't go away, that we've got a lifetime of understanding kind of how this has changed us. The complete destruction of all that has been known as loss of lives, our environment, the community, the daily routines. I have to drive by the Portapique Beach Road every time I visit my parents. And I stop and reflect all the time on kind of how this has changed people. And changed our sense of safety. So the resulting impact occurs at multiple levels of functioning, including the individual, interpersonal, and communal. So again, as we're coming to the close in this province of the public inquiry, as we're waiting to see what kind of recommendations are going to come forward, I think it's important that this again is part of our lived history and kind of where we go from a response plan. It's not up to external people to tell us how this needs to be. I think we have a right from a social justice lens to continue to elevate what are the needs throughout this entire province for all of the ways that we've been affected. And probably one of the biggest things that I have learned along the way, one of my absolute favorite authors, again, is Bell Hooks. Sometimes people try to destroy you precisely because they recognize power, not because they don't see it, because they see it and they don't want it to exist. This comes back to the territory and pathologizing grief and trauma. And I keep thinking about the impacts of who we want to be through this territory. And as the impacts of this pandemic and we start to really thaw from the moral distress and injury that's occurred, how do we use our power collectively to move through this in a way that we can reimagine what could our systems, what could our communities, how do we navigate this with our families? And again, for those of you who may work in fields of healthcare, again, I wasn't sure who would all be attending today. And I think it's important that, again, it comes back to some of that existential, it's that opportunity for people to find meaning. I think about Robert Pope as an artist who depicted the most incredible images of what it's like to go through a life-threatening illness. So one positive quality of cancer or any other serious illness is the way it causes us to focus and consider priorities. So this becomes a trauma response that we're working with. And perhaps it's for the first time. I've often said when I'm working with people, sometimes we are brought to our knees as we're starting to feel around in our life to find out what is important and what we let go of. Circling back, I think about Gord Downey and the impact that he has had in embodying truth and reconciliation in ways that I think he has stood up at the end of his life to really impact so many people across our country, to really take an active stand. And I think about some of the lyrics of his songs, of the Tragically Hip songs. And I think it's so important that this really isn't a dress rehearsal. And I'm reminded at times when we're thrust into moments of grieving, experiences of grieving, what is our life? How is it taking shape? And how are we impacting, as Duran said, what is our moral responsibility for the next 7 generations to come? Very impactful as we're looking as well at different theory bases. And I think we look at some of the work from Bessel van Kolk, kind of slipped my mind for a minute. Again, we know that our bodies remember. And I think it's important that somatically we're also working through. So again, it's not just from a psychological lens. When we think about soul wounds, we think about both the beauty and the grieving that is experienced. So I'm really thrilled when I see us challenging and looking at multiple ways of knowing. I think it's important that as we're coming to our senses and remembering and reminding ourselves of different ways that we are healing, whether it's through visual, sometimes it's these opportunities. I often think as people head into whatever holiday seasons look like for them, it's the smell, it's the textures, it's the tastes, it's the songs that we hear. I think those things all help us remind us to help with that grieving process as we're working through losses and both the beauty and the pain, again, of kind of our experiences in life.
There was a question about how do we help the children who've been impacted by the mass casualty, which I know is really the topic of your 3-part session, but I don't know if there's any comment you can make about that specifically at this point.
I have a slide coming up, and Thank you, Anne, for saying that. And again, next week we're going to talk, that's the focus, is kind of family and community healing and grief and trauma. So we're going to move more into that, but I did include that in the slides here as well. So again, we want to get into some of those tangibles, and here's the slide right here. Somebody must have looked ahead. So I wanted to share with you a couple of things that I got in my mailbox. As people asked across the country, for us to kind of, and again, it wasn't just across the country, it was across the world, asking us to share acknowledges. So sometimes I think it's important that grief does bring us together, and it can create solidarity. And so we had a group of sewers who were making these hearts, and I would not, it was not uncommon to get a call from the post office to come pick up packages with hundreds and hundreds of hearts that I've dropped into a lot of rural mailboxes and shared with other frontline helpers to make sure that they get distributed. To me, there was such beauty in being able to sit that someone was acknowledging as they were working together, and they do this for anyone. I should have shared their website as well. Because they're open to sharing those, and they reached out to say, could you make sure that these get out to people? But I also am including something that I have found very impactful. There was a group of letters that came one day, and I thought, in this time of adverse childhood experiences, there's this dear child named Marcus somewhere out in the world who took a moment to acknowledge this. And I thought for a minute, this circles back to what are we teaching our children and youth right now? So when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, where are we building on adverse childhood knowledge? Where are we helping kids to find their voices because they have them? And I agree, the person that, again, we need to come back and talk about the things that maybe we did well, but again, good intentions are not enough. I think, how are we going to move the dial in this province to continue to build trauma-informed and grief-aware practices for our children? And I think about Marcus. I really wished I had have had a return address, because I would have loved to send Marcus a note back. But I took a picture of this, but the instructions were to put it down at Portapic at the church, and I did. But I always wanted to carry this as a reminder that if 7 generations ahead of us, if we have more Marcuses that are able to say, please take care of each other, be safe, love, Marcus, I know that our knowledge keepers are in better hands if we can help to elevate that grief literacy, find ways for kids to try to help find meaning through these very destructive times that we've had. And that's next week. We'll talk more about that, because again, I think we are up against a massive challenge right now, but I think we have to find the strength in finding the opportunities to see how are we going to continue to work with our kids, that it's okay to talk about trauma and grief and moving forward. So I've relied very heavily on the work, some professional development that I've also done with the Dougie Center. Many of you who have worked alongside know that I have often talked about that. And from a consulting lens, I was in touch with them during the mass casualty to talk about, because they respond in the United States after issues like this. And it was very powerful to kind of talk about the fact that we need to work on the ground with the teachers, with people in the community, youth leaders. Again, this is we're all kind of responsible to kind of lean into this, to help share our knowledge and to help listen. So important that we're kind of striving to change the narrative, knowing that our kids are going to need to be very grief aware, grief literate, and ways that we can look at trauma from a soul wound that is not, again, I want to recognize the impacts of soul wounds on kids, but I also think it's important that we're creating a pathway to actually work with them. Yes, the kids are hurting. I just saw that message pop up. I would agree. I would 100% agree. And again, knowing that our frontline workers have also been impacted, trying to help us from a wounded place, trying to also help support all of the kids that have gone through multiple and intersecting ways of being impacted by trauma across this province. very important that we are finding a way forward. I 100% agree. So we will move into talking about that next week more. But I did want to share that there was somebody out there named Marcus that was pretty transformational for me on days that was pretty hard. Again, I think about the different ways that we're gaining knowledge, understanding, and again, I think about some of the work that Pema Chodron has done. I always believe that she talks about when we think that the point is to pass the test or overcome the problem, but the truth is that things don't really get solved. And I think this is where we can sometimes run into problems with some of our solution-focused approaches, is that there is no solution. They're going to come together, they're going to fall apart, and they keep doing that again and again because that is what life is like. And I think it's so important that we, people on the call, whether you're working alongside someone or within your own sense of self, that the healing comes from letting there be room for all of this to happen, for the grief, for relief, for misery, for joy. It's all part of the lived experience of being human. So I lean on different writers and different approaches, again, from a holistic model, and really leaning heavily in understanding and gaining more and more from what we can learn from traditional Indigenous work and voice, how much we all have to learn from one another. Another author that has really stands out to me, and she did it in one sentence. She said that grief and resilience live together. And I am so thrilled that Michelle Obama put that sentence in her book, because I often think what we've done to resilience, and I get really scared that people try to resilience on me. And I think that we think about this destination without really realizing that there is a complicated relationship to this concept, because I think we do forget. And that's what I got really scared with Nova Scotia Strong. Don't make us strong until we've actually had the opportunity to fall to our knees. Because I think sometimes people forget the cost that resilience comes with. And it is something that we've earned with some of the most painful and difficult things that have happened to us along the way. So to me, this is why I get really scared when I start to see some of the literature coming out about how resilient these rural communities are post this mass casualty. And I'm like, have you really allowed us to talk about our pain yet? Because I get really fearful of what we do again to internalize this and thinking that we're not doing it right, which is not the case at all. We have been affected by trauma. The helps were put in quite quickly, again, from a reactive, well-intentioned place. But what about the long-term strategies? What about the long-term planning? Knowing that if 9/11 comes together and recognizes 21 years later the impacts of what school shootings and things are happening across that country, how much we have work ahead of us, I think it's important as we're trying to decolonize and understand the impacts of colonization. I think we have to, we don't expect people to be resilient. We expect to stand in understanding that there is both pain and beauty through this process, and we can't negate one. Tokapa Turner is another author that I think, again, and this is where I was so excited that we were coming together as a group today. It's so important that I think we're remembering, and that exercise, I hope, was at least a starting point, that to recognize that this being human is tough. And one of the acute losses that we might be feeling right now is that of meaningful friendship and community. And I don't know about you, I have done a lot of deep diving to think about, you know, what does it mean to belong? I'm one of those people that I'm getting really tired of this isolated kind of work. So I can't thank you enough for participating in this the way you have today, because it also, it's so important to be able to feel that engagement together. So she talks about that which our great ancestors took for certain. When a wounding befalls one of us, we're all implicated. And that's what I had hoped today, that this isn't the world according to Serena. This is just some of my own exploring, that I felt grateful from a SchoolsPlus, mental health, and the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, that we could come together just to acknowledge, as you all have, the impacts of all of this. And so we lean in to support those in pain with our humble gifts of empathy and presence. We shoulder our unbearable questions together, and we honor with ritual the devastating requirements and initiations that this being alive asks of us. So Robert Wicks also, again, talks from the resilient clinician. The question is not whether stress will appear and take a toll on us working as clinicians and non-clinicians. Instead, it's to what extent the professionals take the essential steps to appreciate, to limit and learn from this very stress to continue and even deepen our own personal lives and roles as helpers and healers. And I can't tell you, there's been days that I thought, you know what, I don't ever want to hear the words grief and trauma again. But those are the days that I know that I too need to go do my own work. And so I have become so intentional in etching out those spaces of solitude to do some of that existential deep diving around who am I becoming through all of this. So I appreciate, again, as we are trying to shoulder a tremendous load across this province. And again, I want to pay the utmost respect to each of you individually and collectively for the hard work you've done and are continuing to do as we start to draw close to this year of 2022. And thinking that this sprint marathon foolishness stuff that we were throwing out there was going to start to make more sense. Somehow I think it's taking us a bit deeper into the territory. But I think those are the things that we get to sift through the sand and find the nuggets of gold, start to understand, like, who do we become? How do we help to kind of make space to challenge our systems to expand and deepen? And for those of you who may also like Gabren, I really believe that sometimes we have to pay attention to, again, and the theme of our silence. I hope you're feeling that the recognition of this is so important right now, because sometimes we haven't been able to reveal what it is that we want to say. And I think sometimes it's important that we stop and pay tribute to the silence of all of the voices, the non-dominant voices that have not yet had an opportunity to come forward and tell us in a safe, psychologically safe way, the messages that we need to hear. And for those of you, again, who may need kind of that terminology, we want to come back to recognizing the impacts of disenfranchised grief and trauma as from us, the healers, the helpers, the guidance counselors, the social workers, whoever's on the call. I think, again, it's important. And I lean on Mary Lou Kelly, who, again, is a Canadian. She's a nurse who has wrote some beautiful, she's done some beautiful work on really looking at the disenfranchisement. And she looked through a long-term care lens and the impacts on workers. And so it's so interesting when you stop and take a moment to understand that in all of our work, it's so relational, and our jobs are really to build these safe, trusting relationships with other human beings, without realizing that the impacts of their lives, the impacts of the end of their lives, whatever that might be, some of the trauma that they may have experienced, actually, again, we recognize that grief is a continual emotion, and it really is embedded in the work that we do. So being able to talk and make space and do some of this work from an organizational perspective, I think as we continue to evolve in making our workplaces, our teams, looking at some of that facilitated peer-led support, knowledge, I think, again, we start to unpack the professional lens of this and how this work does affect us in some of the most challenging, but also some of the most impactful ways. I think I forgot to put this book up as well. This is a new book, actually a physician wrote. And I took this excerpt because I was really touched by the way he talked about this. And I can make sure that I get this to you. This is from Paul Clonty, and he calls it trauma, the invisible epidemic, how trauma works and how we can heal. And what I really loved was the first sentence, that healing from trauma often takes heartfelt grieving, but trauma gets in grieving's way with anger, guilt, and shame. So when we start to talk about family-centered and community-centered practices, this to me is part of the complexity of really making space for heartfelt grieving. When there are so many feelings of guilt and shame that have intersected all of this, that have made it such a hard topic to bring up. He talks about trauma can burden us, disorient us, dishearten us. And again, he really talks about the impact of co-regulation. We need each other. We need support from each other. We need to accept help. We also need to give it. And sometimes the only help we can give or receive is a willingness to sit with what feels unbearable. If we can do that, trauma inevitably starts to loosen its grip over time, enough at least to allow the light to shine in and to allow healing to begin. Trauma isn't just an individual issue. An indispensable part of helping is standing against ignorance, prejudice, and malice, and standing up for compassion, community, and humanity. Oh, sorry, bad colors here, I guess. In crisis care, it's important that we live with this paradox of knowing that I am at the same time part of a great wound and also part of the healing. And I think those are important things that I continue to vacillate. Again, coming back and forth to understand that sometimes the wound feels greater, and sometimes I can start to find my space through the healing, the collective healing that some or all of people are starting to acknowledge. So it's important as we go through this.
Sorry, there is a question that has come up more than once about people wanting some of the slides that you've created to share it on social media or share it with others. Some people have been taking screenshots as you've been presenting, and truthfully, your slides, the pictures, everything is so beautiful. So I don't know if you're comfortable with people sharing the screenshots that they've taken, sharing your PowerPoint with people after. You don't need to respond now, but I just wanted to let you know. What we're inviting you all to do is we are going to be uploading this to our Nova Scotia College of Social Workers YouTube video. So you can share the entire video, which has Serena speaking in addition to these beautiful slides, which of course adds a lot more depth and wisdom to it. So we do hope that you encourage people to watch the videos, and we will be uploading that as soon as possible as well. So just wanted to acknowledge that because the question keeps coming up over and over again. So, and our YouTube video is on the chat.
I just want to say thank you for asking the question, because this demonstrates psychological safety and it demonstrates being trauma informed by asking, and I deeply appreciate that. I love when we're starting to embody this. So again, if there's something that's resonating for you that feels like an important message, again, from a trust perspective, I appreciate that you're asking me those questions. I have included my email at the end of this if you need to want to reach out, by all means. But if you feel that there's something that resonates that someone is going to take that could be important for others to hear, I appreciate that. And I want to come back again just to acknowledge the trauma stewardship. And I'm just going to kind of wrap up our presentation here in the next couple of minutes to open up space for us to have some dialogue if people would like. And maybe at that point we could just stop the recording and just have an opportunity to kind of lean into the space and see how people are doing. Before, and I know I'm seeing some people are needing to get off the call, I do want to encourage everyone, and I just want to stop for a minute just to be able to say that I hope each of you can take a moment to do something for yourself for transition. I think it's important when somebody starts to ask or validates or honors or respects the work that you do, the person you are, that sometimes can make us feel quite emotional. So I always encourage people that if it's fresh air, if it's a cup of tea, if it's listening to some music, before you go into the next thing that you have to do, those are great ways of really beginning to honor your own experience with the material, your feelings, your own soul wounds. So I just want to acknowledge that for people who may need to get off the call early. Trauma stewardship, I think so important that we understand in Nova Scotia that we are being entrusted with people's stories and their lives. This is both an incredible honor, but it is also a tremendous responsibility. So for those of you who are working in any social or health sectors, wow, it's so important that we're doing our own work around our own soul wounds. And I think those are so, like, it is such an important message that if a good friend of mine were on the call right now, I said, we're way beyond kale and warm bubble baths. This really is about doing our own work and exploring our own sense of meaning around our own lived experiences with trauma and grief. And that helps us to kind of lean in honest and vulnerable and courageous ways to start to look at long-term strategies that will help us remain whole, which to me is important. Helpful and tending to what our lived experiences have brought us as well. Parker Palmer talks about at the deepest levels of human life, we do not need techniques. We need insights into ourselves and our world that help us understand how to learn and grow from our experiences of diversity, tension, and conflict. And I so appreciate that. I know that there's so much wisdom on this call, and so many of you who may do trauma-specific work, those of you who are eager to learn more about trauma-informed practices, let this just be kind of an introduction to people who may not have had other experience, that we want to continue to keep learning. This isn't a narrative. It isn't a bunch of tools and techniques. It's really a shift in all of our practices to help keep individuals, families, groups of people feeling more safe to be able to tell us what it is that they need. And so coming together to understand that we are all in this together. And I am so deeply grateful for these sessions to wrap up 2022, because I think I need this as well. I need to feel this sense of being in this together with a group of people who are just as passionate out there. So I wish that we were all sitting in a room together. It's such an appreciation of the value of otherness and all of the skills and knowledge and lived experience of everyone that's on this call today. I think that's so important, that there's no one way of knowing, there's no one way of working. What we need to do is to keep expanding on that otherness idea and making sure that we're listening to and understanding and growing more into being professions that are working hard to decolonize, to break down the injustices of grief and trauma in this province. I think it's an ability to hold tension in life-giving ways. This is not easy work, and I respect that. And we're talking about things that we don't want to. Our narrative have not been open to talk about violence and racism and all of the ways that trauma gets experienced. I think it's really about helping people find a sense of personal voice and agency. That's where we will continue to keep expanding to create and build the capacity to create communities in a province that's moving beyond the soul wound into really understanding what this feels like. To be part of a collective that's moving towards something feeling much more healthy and I don't know, I don't use the word easily, but hopeful. So when we think about the legacy and social imprint, and this to me guides every bit of work that I do, I know that one day I too will hang up my shingle, my hat, my whatever as a social worker, but I often want to think about what can I do? And that's kind of what helps me to keep thinking about, we can become more trauma informed, we can become more sensitive, we can affect policy and change. And to me, that helps to guide that. I know for generations of social workers who may be coming into the field, that will help to make this a profession, again, that we're caring for each other, supporting one another, learning from one another. So important as we're moving forward. So I think my favorite meme in 2020 to 2022 was this one. I have been so impacted by both the thoughts and prayers that people send, but also the impact of really how are we going to move forward with policy and change and a stronger advocacy lens around making our province a place that we can honestly have dialogue and critique and do a critical analysis of the things that we're not doing well and can expand upon, and the things that maybe have been incredibly helpful along the way. So I want to say thank you to each of you for your participation in this. And no matter how you've been able to show up, I thank you for that. And for joining us. I was really shocked to hear how many people would be joining in today. And I thank you for this space. And for those of you who would like to join for next week, we're going to move into talking a bit more about community and family practice.
Thank you so very much for this beautiful session. There are a couple of questions before I even turn off the recording that have come up. So one is, how does one avoid trauma bonding? Are there any resources you suggest about trauma bonding and how to break it? To me, it seems unhealthy. And then there's another question, but let's start with this one maybe.
So again, I want to open this up for people that want to participate in the conversation of trauma bonding, because again, I've been paying a tremendous amount of attention to the things that connect us and the things that inadvertently are starting to disconnect us. Again, I think from a place of trying to work through and co-regulate, we really need to be mindful. And then that's why I keep saying being intentional about our own work. But I'd love to hear from other people. I don't want to feel like I've just been talking a lot. So does anybody want to kind of chime in and talk a little bit about trauma bonding?
I see a lot of gratitude flowing in through our chat, but I don't know.
We can bring it back up next week. I'll make a note of it. And
That's
there is there
good.
another.
The other question is, I wonder why silencing others' pain is so common and at times almost desperate. Might it be a fear of our own pain? How much might be healed if everyone was united in truly being free to feel their own grief and loss?
What a powerful comment. And I think that's the thing. There was a beautiful little video I used to show called Tear Soup. And I always remember one comment that was in this children's story about how much another person can handle of another person's tear soup. But until we create spaces to actually, and so I actually used to make soup and take it to groups and open up space for us to come together and talk about the tears in our soup. And it was so powerful across the lifespan of the significance of how people could understand that suffering and grief is part of our lived experience. To me, what's abnormal is really the silencing of it all. So I appreciate the silencing of people's pain, and I'm delighted that that theme came out as significant, even for your own experiences. Being able to even chime in on the group chat was so significant, to be able to acknowledge that this has been hard. And I hope that that in itself has felt like a way to feel seen, heard, and validated in this as well.
I think so. I think we will continue dialoguing amongst ourselves. Hopefully everyone will join us again next week. And I know that Kristen Anderson joins me, as well as all of the wonderful organizations and people who helped put this together, in thanking you. And we will continue to dialogue, but I am going to stop recording in a moment. I wonder if Kristen has a few comments that she would like to make.
Gratitude. I think I'm sitting with the I'm appreciating the normalcy of the last 2.5 hours of this conversation, the bravery of individuals who asked questions, put kind of comments and pieces in the chat, and noticing my own variety of feelings as we move forward to the next 2 weeks of this. I'm also acutely aware of, we had over 250 people at one time that were joining this presentation. And as well, I received a bunch of messages with people who were not able to join today just because their clients, communities, and families needed them in a different way. So again, I am so grateful to Anne and the college to be able able to open this up outside of our social work community with our partners across understanding the variety of levels and the number of people that this topic connects with. So thank you for that. And Serena, I could sit and listen to you all day in terms of the work. It's almost that connection, that ability, as you say things, it ignites another kind of synapse going on in my brain in terms of, oh yes, I've been there, I've done that. So much gratitude there. I'll flip it over to Danielle, Melody, Jolene to see if there's any kind of final pieces.
I just want to echo your comments, Kristen. So much gratitude to the college for hosting us and for being willing to open it up to the larger community and our colleagues, no matter where they're working, because we all know that they care. And that caring really is what's needed right now and probably forever. And much gratitude to you, Serena. I know this has been a chaotic fall and in many ways it's been a chaotic past couple of years. But to put yourself out there and put the topics that you're so passionate about and so knowledgeable about, to share that with us. And I'm actually, I think I was in awe throughout the entire chat piece, because for everyone to be so honest and open and share some of their experience. So a lot of love going out to everyone who participated in that. And I think that means we have much more to share and much more to bring to this conversation. So I'm looking so forward to the next 2 weeks as well. Thank you.
Agreed. Thank you so much. It is an honor for us at the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers to join with you all in helping to support you, both social workers and those who join social workers in the healing work. And it's also been really lovely to see how many people have joined even from outside of Nova Scotia, from outside of Canada even. Grief knows no boundaries and we're all united. And it's an honor. Serena, you led the province of Nova Scotia in the healing after this tragic event. And we are still struggling with the tension between what we're told go back to normal and what we all know needs to happen, which is that we need to become something new, something different, something more aware. So, because that's really how we prevent future traumas from replicating. So we're grateful to you and to everyone who's joining, because that's part of what this is we want all of us to be united together and empowered in bringing healing. Any closing words before I press stop on the recording, Serena?
I just want to echo and I say thank you that this was beyond my expectations for engagement, and I just really appreciate people's ability to participate today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.